for having me today. Just a little background about myself. My paying day job, I just last year retired as a service engineer for General Motors after 35 years. But my real love in life is tractors and Minneapolis mowing. I got started back, I was about 2 years old when I started getting on my grandfather's tractors. They farmed with Minneapolis Molings. In fact, my grandfather bought a 1951 U propane, and after that, he was so enthralled with that tractor that they became dealers for Minneapolis Molings. So, growing up with my uncle and grandfather and their collections, and they had a large collection in Calcasieu, Michigan, the Cotton family, and I just became a member of the MMCI Club and the PGR magazine, and I work with a lot of you in the room on the board of directors of some of these clubs and doing special projects and so forth, and I really enjoy it. So that's a little bit about myself. What I'd like to talk to today is the earlier development of the A4T tractor by Minneapolis Molding. I had the opportunity of working with Mike Verhulst, and Mike Verhulst was an engineer for Minneapolis Molding, and he was 25 years old when in 1969, early 69, Minneapolis Molding was having discussions about the fact that other competitors had large four-wheel drive tractors, and Minneapolis Molding and Oliver didn't have anything for that market. So there was an interest in trying to develop something, but they were realizing they were kind of late to the market. So Mike, being a farmer himself and an engineer, he went home one day and one weekend in late February, and he actually came up with a concept and brought it into Minneapolis Molding. And long story short is he was the lead engineer on this project. But when he went in and he had a concept and vision, and he presented it to MM. And one of the things he was given is he had a 9-month time frame from concept to development. So he was pitching this thing end of February, and they were in production. The first tractor rolled off the assembly line, I believe, in November. So, I mean, the first production tractor. Now, they had a prototype that rolled off the line on March 16th. So that was pretty quick. So I like to give some notice or recognition to Ruth Book and Lauren Book also. They put a lot of this presentation together. And Brian Gagne also, he's on the MMCI Club, and he spent a lot of time putting data. He's kind of our data guy. He spent a lot of time in the basement here at the museum in Charles City getting data and putting together production records. He's the guy who's, when a question comes up on the internet, he's got the facts. It's not opinion. He comes in with the facts, and it's just, we're really lucky to have him support our club as well as this presentation. So, okay, so I mentioned that Mike presented this idea. He actually went home in late February, and over a weekend, he carved this model. This was actually, he did build model his kids, and he joked around that I had no money to afford toy tractors when I was a kid, but I couldn't afford implements, so I made all my own implements. So he took his childhood skill of building implements and actually carved this thing, and this is the actual model. In fact, rumor is it's somewhere around here in the museum. And this was something that they took it into the CEO of the company, and it kind of went through the marketing people, and they said, man, we love it. And he pitched it as the fact that this tractor could be mostly made out of existing components from the 50 series. So they're and they actually called it the Maverick, but the Maverick name, no, we're having problems. Is it just loading slow? The Maverick model or name was something that they were going to give the tractor, but unfortunately Ford was just coming out with a name and model for their Maverick small car, if you remember, around that same time. And they decided they didn't want to take on Ford for the rights of the name, so they came up with a different name. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, that must switch to one slide. But anyway, subsequently he went on and did 3 more models. I put them together. We'll talk about that green one because that was his next project in a minute. But so the early A4T, again, it was the idea was they had to come up with this thing really quick. So they were going to use all 1050, 950, and 1350 components. But the problem they were having is they're kind of short on design resources and engineering resources because these products were just getting launched themselves. But the limitations were that the biggest engine they had was the 585 that put out about 143 horsepower, and they were wanting to have a bigger tractor than that. So the whole idea and the concept was we're going to start off with 110 horsepower on the A14 1400 and go up to 143 horsepower for the A4T 1600, but they wanted to design for increases of up to 250 horsepower. They knew that they didn't have the powertrains yet to get there, but they designed the whole tractor around trying to get to that size. So another enabler for this, that slide I think just loading slow. Another enabler is they said, okay, Mike, if you think this can happen, we're going to make you the lead engineer on the project. That was quite an honor for a gentleman who was 25 years old at the time. Can you imagine putting that in somebody, 25-year-old's hands? But anyway, they said, what do you need to do to make this successful? He says, well, we can't go through a normal development process because we just won't have the time. It's going to have to be a top priority. So what they did is they went to all the departments and said, hey, we need you to prioritize. If Mike asks for something, we need to make it a priority. And if you can't make it, let us know why not and so forth. After it was pitched, they said, well, okay, well, who's going to buy a Minneapolis molding rather than a Steiger or something else? And they felt that they had a benefit of using current production components that were already validated and tested. So it wouldn't be much that was new other than some components we'll talk about. Lower cost because a lot of the engineering development work had already been done on a lot of components. We're driving high reliability, low tooling investment. And of course, as we talked about, the short development time, they were 3 months from the time they had that wooden model till they drove one off the line for a test. And in the 50-50 weight distribution, they felt that that was very important for traction and soil compaction. And when you weigh, people say, well, no, I know that tractor, it's a lot heavier in the front. But when you start looking at the drawbar load, it naturally transfers power from the front axle to the rear axle under load. So that's what they're referring to with power split too. Okay. Yeah, very beneficial because I know the front wheel assist tractors, they're really nice with loader and so forth on, but you get them out in the field on a heavy pull, especially the early ones, the weight distribution, the front wasn't pulling that much. It really helped you with turns in the corners, but the four-wheel drive was definitely the solution for that. Okay. And then this is just a diagram for the weight distribution. Now, the other thing that they were fighting with, as we mentioned earlier, is tractor horsepower needs were growing exponentially. In 1965, a big tractor was 100 horsepower. The G1000 was Minneapolis Molding's market for that, and I think what was it, 1900 or 1800 hour was kind of in that. Yeah, was kind of in that category. And then by 1970, 150 horsepower was the norm, and then by 75, you're probably looking at 200 horsepower. And I think they were there. Well, they definitely were there. So this grew pretty quick, and they had to have something to fill that need. So in this, I'll also mention just a diagram for weight distance and flotation and so forth, because compaction, I think, as any farmer would know, it gets to be a problem for you with crops. And then this shows a demonstration, a diagram of power, and when you're trying to turn under power, it's very difficult. With a conventional tractor, with a four-wheel drive articulated tractor, it makes that much easier. And here's a picture with toy tractors with the same concept. Okay, and then other advantages that were manufacturing availability. Obviously, they had to have a different line set up. They had to manufacture a little differently for configuration of the A4T. But again, all the components that they were using, the transmission, the axles, the engines, and so forth, those production lines could remain pretty much intact from what they were doing consistently or concurrently with the 50 series programs. This picture is actually, it's a little bit contaminated or corrupt on the computer, but what's showing is the hinge and the mainframe. That was the first component that they really had to develop. And then, of course, the front one was where the engine and so forth supported. And you can see in the picture there, the steering cylinders, those are all components that had to be designed. Whereas if you look here, the rear axle, there was front and rear axle. They're both common actually to the G950 Minneapolis Molding for their initial production. There was a 1050 axle available, but a 1050 the axle was taking the power from the whole engine, whereas with A4T, it was dividing between the two axles, so it didn't really need to use the larger axle, or so we thought. So the difference between the two-wheel drive tractor and the four-wheel drive is the two-wheel drive, the pinion was in the transmission, and it was part of the differential in the rear of the tractor. When they went to the A4T, that shaft from the back, it didn't have a pinion on it. It had a shaft that drove into the drop box, transfer case or drop box, and then the drop box dropped down and split off the drive shafts to the front and rear axles. And of course, they had the U-joints for the articulation down there. We have a picture of that somewhere here too, but okay. Some of the components, these components were mostly carryover from the 50 series as far as the hydraulic tank and the grill and so forth here, but this frame is specific to the A4T because it is the same main frame and support that was supporting the engine, whereas on the two-wheel drive tractors, the engine basically supported, they had some frame rails, but this whole main frame supported it. So that was the long lead development time. Okay, so this also mentioned they had to, when they're the concept that he used, when in doubt, build it stout, was what they kept saying, because they know even though it was adequate for today, they had to plan for 250 horsepower, and we'll get to where they actually did do that, or at least one of them. So here's the hinge within the pivot point. You're showing where the articulation, the big pin. I think we see some later that the pins weren't big enough and they got a little bit loose in there, but they tried to design it as stiff as possible to start with. Next slide, here's a top view looking down. You can see that mount right here this is the front, and I believe that's where the drop box support was. The rear support of the drop box had mounts that bolted here, and then it was supported in the front of the engine on the main frame also. You can see the two together here. And then the next slide. Okay, so this is a diagram of the hydraulics. The hydraulics, you know, they use some of the components, pump and reservoir and that kind of thing, the control valves, but obviously a lot of the plumbing had to change. But probably the biggest change is they had a big hydraulic pump that was underneath the pulley that drove. It had three belts that drove for the steering control for the cylinders. That took a lot of volume and a lot of pressure to be able to steer that thing quickly. So they had to have that auxiliary pump. Now, is that running out of cylinder? Are you doing that? Okay, okay. So this is underneath the dash with the sheet metal, and you can just see that that's the valve that diverts the steering hoses each to the right and left cylinders for steering. Okay, next. And now you're looking at a top view showing the control cables and so forth. There was mechanical linkage on the 50 series, but this is one of the differences. The valve and so forth was in the back half of the tractor, so they had cables to allow the tractor to articulate and still be able to run the cables to the same valve. There's the view of the drop box, and you can see this is the bottom of it where the drive shafts come, going front and rear. And the under, you see the drawbar. This is very much in common with the 50 series. The brakes and everything were the same. The difference, they use the same brake assemblies, but with the 1050, 950, they use mechanical linkage. And of course, with the articulation of the tractor, you had to use hydraulics here. So you had a hydraulic master cylinder underneath the dash, and then you had wheel cylinders here on the brakes to allow your fluid transfer to apply the brakes rather than the mechanical linkage.
Is that cable then for parking brakes?
Yes. So the parking brake cable was actually shared and borrowed from the Vista tractor. The G1000 Vista also used hydraulic brakes. Just because of the position of the Vista platform, I think it would have required a complete redesign of the mechanical linkage from the G1000, G900, but they solved that also. The difference was that with the Vista, they had two master cylinders, so you could use turning brakes, whereas the articulated tractor, the A4T, you only had one master cylinder because you didn't have turning brakes like you normally don't do on a four-wheel drive. The challenge that created, and this was something Mike and I talked about, is you had one master cylinder trying to fill two wheel cylinders, and so you had to have the volume in one master cylinder to fill two wheel cylinders. Well, the hydraulic principle in brakes there, the smaller your bore on your master cylinder gives you more PSI for given foot pressure, and the larger your bore on the output gives you more clamping load. But the issue they had was they were running out of fluid. So if they would have gone to a smaller bore, they wouldn't have had enough to fill both wheel cylinders. So one of the challenges on the A4T is the brakes weren't quite what they would like to have been. They just didn't have the volume. So there was actually a service bulletin written telling them to adjust the brakes just a minimum clearance to where you didn't have to have much of a stroke before you had brake supply so you didn't run out of fluid in your master cylinder. We fixed that on the 1900. I'll get to that. All right. So this is just another photo of the front mainframe. Next page. Going down the assembly line, this is one of the production lines.
And that is at the Lake Street plant?
Yeah.
Is that
Was that actual production, or were those the new build tractors there?
I don't know which. The first prototype was hand built in the production shop. So they had a prototype shop apparently up there, but that was all busy doing 50 series components. So they actually had this built up in their production line shop. And it was a big advantage, and I know Mike talked about that, is because when they went to production, they were always already kind of familiar with the tractor because the prototypes had run through there. So it probably was the main production line, but it may have been mules or prototype tractors at the time. It's hard to tell. I'm not sure. This is, so the other thing that was a little bit different is the PTO on this. If you look at the articulation, you got two U-joints going back on the hinge, and on the back of the drop box, there was a piggyback gearbox for the PTO. So this PTO gearbox just piggybacked off the back of the drop box on the back of the transmission. That's how they did it. If the tractors had PTO. The very first 1400s didn't have PTOs, but the later ones did, and that's how they did it. And then when you get to the back half, where the shaft comes in, it was just like a 50 series tractor. The whole, for the back half, the PTO was just the same. They just, rather than driving the shaft through the center of the transmission, it was driven and dropped and changed ratios.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
On the drop box there, I know they had a lot of fuel complaints. It was real noisy.
Mm-hmm.
And did they ever change from spur gears to helical gears?
They did.
They did, yeah.
I've got the only tractor
I
that's like
remember
that.
that, but I couldn't.
So the whole tractor was noisy with the spur gears. And they weren't so bad with the 1400s because most of them didn't have cabs. But that was, I think, a huge advantage for Oliver. Sorry, all molding guys. But the helical gears with the collar shift was a lot quieter when you get cabs on them, especially. But so the prototype 1900 had helical gears in the transmission and in the drop box. And it was, I don't have a cab on it, but it's much quieter. Okay. And here's a good view of the transmission in the drop box. You can see the transmission, the drop box, and then this is your mounts that we showed you on the mainframe in the back in the earlier picture.
But that transmission was almost the same as a 1050.
The earlier one was. Again, the difference is you didn't have the pinion on it. You had a straight shaft through that drove into the drop box. Other than that, yeah, I think the part numbers of everything inside would have been the same. Now, the drop box was a 2-speed drop box. So you had the lower shaft had a collar shifting gear that was cable driven. Well, actually on the original tractor was a mechanical lever driving it that you could shift, not on the fly, obviously, but you had the ability to go to high and low first. So you had a total of 10 speeds. You had the original tractor did not have an ample torque. It had the 5-speed manual transmission with just a straight shaft through where the ample torque were on the 2-wheel drive tractors. They felt that the bigger tractors, the ample torques were a little bit iffy on some of the 2-wheel drive tractors. They started getting into the 585s and so forth, and they just didn't feel comfortable using it with the weight and extra load of the A4T. So they put a straight shaft, and you got the second. You had 10 speeds, but you couldn't shift on a fly like you could with an ample torque on the original production tractors for that reason. Now, there's been some collectors that have put ample torques in them, but I don't know how much farming they're doing with them. Jay, you might know about that, but you probably heard of them too. Yeah. Okay, and the rear fenders, that was an option, but here's a picture of one with rear fenders on it. Next page. And this is, I believe, one of the final production. The reason I say final production is because I don't think any of the prototype tractors the early prototypes were different colors of yellow and grays and greens and so forth. I think the red ones were probably the first production ones, except as she's showing they had several. There's a real early one. I think that one was actually painted yellow. I think the first one off the line was yellow, and then they tried a couple of different shades. They had one they even painted one half at one shade of yellow and the other half the other shade of yellow to try to get some marketing feedback on it. So this is a production timing. You're showing that initial production was going to be just the 504 diesel tractor. That was the 1400. And it actually showed that they intended to do an LP, but they never did build any 1400 LPs. That never went to productions. The LPs were all 1600s using a 504B that was a little more horsepower than the standard 504.
Didn't they make some of the 800?
They did. So some later tractors had the 800 cubic inch, which was a 200 horsepower. The issue with the 800 is that a lot of the tillage was done in second gear, and second gear did not last real long under full load of a 225 plus horsepower engine. And that's why they deemed that was not going to work for production. And therefore we went to the design of the A4T 1900. And we'll get into that 1900 So this is just another picture of, this was, I believe, one of the first prototypes because it was painted yellow on the test track with an instrumentation truck. Now here's the power chain breakdowns. You can see that there was the 4 engines that were initially the 504A6, which was the or the D504, that was for the 1400, and then with a turbo, that was an optional engine. I think they call it an altitude compensator in production. They didn't actually call it a turbo. But then the 506B was what went into the 1600s. That was the same engine that went into the 1350s and later the 1355 LPs. They turned them up a little bit, and they're putting a little more horsepower than the normal 504 did in like a 1050 tractor. And then, of course, the 585 was a direct injected diesel. That was much bigger, a little bit later, 1600 usage only. Just a picture of a field testing of an A4T with an instrumentation truck. Dean probably drove that truck occasionally, I'm guessing.
No.
That was probably in Hopkins the whole time.
The one that we have in the museum was the
Okay.
dynamometer car, that had all the instrumentation.
Yeah, this probably was up in Hopkins, I'm guessing.
Yep, that was.
Okay. And here's another picture of the initial tractor. There's a question? Yeah.
Did Mike ever say how many that they built, the prototype ones, or how many were yellow?
So I know what the first one was yellow as I drove off the line. I think this is probably it. But he said in a lot of the literature that when Charles City, when Hopkins shut down, there was a few dozen, took it like 20 to 40 tractors that were actually shipped from Hopkins to Charles City. He said a lot of those were primered, and they were shipped in primer because they were waiting for orders. And if they got an order from Oliver dealer, they were green. If they got an order from Moline dealer, they're red. And then they ran out of primer toward the end. They just painted them all red. And some of the red ones got repainted green. But apparently there was at least 2 or 3 that he knew that the farmers didn't want a red Moline, so they painted them yellow. So there were some yellow ones that were painted, but I'm not sure it was more than 2 or 3. Now, people say, well, you hear this a lot. Why were the A4Ts red? Molines were supposed to be yellow. Well, the story was that, the Molines were getting a little bit of a bad name after some problems with the G1000s. And they wanted to kind of try to disassociate the new articulated tractor a little bit. And they were having real good luck with the white Minneapolis Moline combines. So they were trying to let's make the A4T look more like the combines. So that's really what it was. It was strictly a marketing thing for image. So interesting, but that's what they did. Okay. A4T doing a field test down in Arizona, down by Flagstaff, I believe. Now here's a 1600. The 1600, of course, had the bigger engines, and then the 1600 had the option for the PTO and 3-point in the cabs. Most of them had the cabs, and this is an earlier one. You can tell because we call them bubble nose versus flat nose. So if you look in this area, you'll see the bubble nose design. That was on all the 50 series. So the 950, 1050, 1350, and the A4T all got that bubble nose, and the later ones got a flat nose. It was a cab. A casting. It looked kind of more like a lot of the Oliver castings, and that's what the later tractors had. I think spring of I think 1970 productions when that went in.
And the flat nose one, they had enough room up there for the reservoir, because that hydraulic reservoir was up there.
Yeah, it's just as long. It just made the hood longer. So the bubble nose hood, if you go get them, if you want to get a hood for one of these tractors, you better know if it's bubble nose or flat nose, because if you put a bubble nose hood on a flat nose, it's gonna be too short. Yeah. Now here's an actual picture. This is the Allers family A4T back in Humboldt, South Dakota. I think probably about 2009, and I drove that tractor on a tractor ride, and Mike showed up. I like, Mike, we got to get your picture on the A4T. So this is a risky picture, but that was Mike probably in 2009, 2010, or whenever that show was, on an A4T that had been used for many years. Here's there you go. Here's the example of the bubble nose versus flat nose, and the difference between the Oliver 2655 and the A4T 1600. Could you go back to that slide? You can tell, Dean, right there that they're actually the same length in the hydraulic tank area.
I thought you wanted to show how much superior the Oliver was.
Well, it didn't fade as fast, did it? We'll get some Oliver digs in, don't worry. All right. So this is, so interesting enough, a little bit about when the A4T was completed, they recognized that it had a need for power, for more power. So they went on and they actually started designing the next concept of it was going to A4T 1700 and an A4T 1900. And those were increased horsepower versions with a lot of the improvements we talked about. We're going to cover that. But Mike Verhulst went on to be the driveline engineer. He was actually taken off the A4T program, and he was the driveline engineer for the 4150 White. So that was a low profile. If people have seen 4150s, they sit much lower than A4T. And here's an example of it. An A4T versus now this is the prototype 1600. We talked earlier about having the green sheet metal on it. So I'm sorry, the prototype 4150. And this is known, and my understanding is this spent some time in a field around Charles City. It was on the Jaden farm. So that made its way from Hawkins down to Charles City. And this is probably in Dean's backyard. So interestingly enough, Mike left White Farm Equipment, I believe in 75, or right around that time frame, and went to John Deere. And when he left, they actually, he took or was given or bought or something, the 4150 White prototype, the experimental unit. And that's actually now in my barn, proudly in Michigan. What I'm wondering, if anybody knows, did this tractor actually get upfitted with the silver sheet metal, and is it the same unit? I don't know how many prototypes there were.
Can you scratch the paint of the green under it on the chassis side of it?
I don't remember. That was one of the things I was going to
Does
do.
yours have pressed steel wheels then?
No, it's got different wheels. It's got 34-inch wheels and tires, but that could have been easily changed. But yeah, there's some things in the very front is different, but that could have been a change too. You just don't know. But mine's got a lot of the X serial numbers on it, and I don't know how many they made it like that, but I'm sure it wasn't more than a handful. It may be a different one, but okay. Next slide.
Is there any discussion from Mike on why they went with the 3208 instead of like an inline 6 cat or Cummins or?
It was probably cost. Yeah. They didn't advertise this as being a tillage tractor like a Versatile or a Steiger. They intended it to be more like a row crop articulated track. And the people that took it out and wanted to compete with a 200 or 250 horse Steiger or Versatile were pretty disappointed, but that wasn't the intent of it. It was, so an A4T weighed between 1,800 to 2,000 pounds. These tractors only weighed about 15,000 pounds. They were much lighter and, built all together. But the idea was they were lighter, they were shorter, more agile. That A4T is a Hulk.
They were marketed as a, fully row crop tractor.
Yeah, that was not
A
intended.
lot of field demonstrations, you'd see them out plowing corn. Television corn.
It was intended to be a little bit different market. So now, when you got up to the bigger tractors, when it developed into something with a Cummins in it, then it was definitely a tillage tractor, or a cat or something. Like the 22 or the 4270 with that big cat in it. It was no doubt a tillage tractor, but. Okay, so anyway, we talked a lot about the deficiency and the need for more power in the A4T, and that's when the concept of the A4T 1900 came up. And the 1900 was a concept, if we go to the next slide, please. This is actually, and I have a few items that probably nobody's seen before. So this is a bill of material that Mike gave to me and said, this needs to stay with the A4T 1900. It's a bill of material. It shows all the components and so forth that were intended to be sourced for the A4T 1700 and A4T 1900. If you look here, originally they talked about having A4T 1900. But then when you got into the bill of material, some of the dates later in the year or earlier in the spring of 1970, I believe it was, they started calling it a 1700. So as I dig through this, and that my recollection, we're talking with Mike, is they were going to turbocharge a 585, and it was going to increase horsepower 15 or 20, and they were going to call that an A4T 1700. It was going to get the higher horsepower transmission, which had the helical gears and was intended for 250 horse, but it was going to be marketed as a 1700. When they truly went to a 1900, the intent was, you can go next slide, the intent was that you would actually go to a the 800 cubic inch LP, which was like we talked 225, 250 horse, depending on application. And there were the Cummins or the diesel was actually going to be a 250 horse 855 Cummins. So that's how they were going to get to 250 horse with the 1900. Now this picture, and I think Dean knows it, is Snoopy, because this went from Hopkins down to Charles City. This is actually equipped, if you look closely, I believe with a 585 turbo. And it's labeled as a 1900, but again, early on they were going to call them all 1900s. But then they dial it back and decide, you know, just the 1900s are going to be the 200 horse versions. The 150, 160 horse version, we're going to call those 1700s. Now, the marketing plan also was that the 1700 was not going to have a power shift, but the 1900 was going to have the 2-speed power shift. So we talked about having a 2-speed transfer case and drop box, but the transmission not having enough capacity for the 200 horse and the mechanical torque that was in them not having enough. So the solution was to go to a power shift 2-speed amplitorque. So if you look, there's some pictures here too. If you, maybe the next slide. It's not on here, but I'll describe it. So this is actually in the basement. So at the museum here, you're going to see a picture, or you're not going to see that. You're going to see the actual drop box and transmission down there. But what it was is the 1910 was it was a fully helical transmission, and it went from a 5-speed to a 4-speed. So they used basically the same packaging space. And there's actually right there, if we keep it on the slide, that's the cutaway prototype that's in the basement of the museum. You can go down and look at it. And you'll see on the outside there, that's the normal 5-speed gear set, the spur gear set that was very noisy. If you look inside the case, they packaged 4-speed gears. And the gears are much bigger, but so you can only get 4 sets in there. But they're all helical. So that's how they got that transmission up to the horsepower needs they did. Now, the other weakness was that the reverse, if you took an early A4T and really got rough with it and dumped the clutch, you could break the side of the transmission where the reverse idler was. So on this one, they kind of beefed up that area, and they made a bolt-on plate where the reverse idler gear was. So if you happen to have a problem, you just unbolt the two and replace the gear and the idler. It's kind of a slick thing. But there was 4 of these castings made from what we could tell. Experimental 1, Experimental 2, and Experimental 3 were cast in the side of them. Experimental 2 and Experimental number 3 were bolted together in nose to nose in what they call a 4-square test fixture. And what they do is and you can see it, here's a demonstration. This is actually something Mike wrote up, but it's a description of it if somebody's interested in it. But what you did is you locked the output shafts between the two, and you coupled the input shafts, and you drove it with a 10-horse motor. And what it effectively did by just using a 10-horse test motor, it put the gear loads up to to simulate 250 horsepower, and they ran them through durability tests on the dyno, and they could determine over time how the gears would live. And my understanding is that did very well, because when they did that, they actually put power to the clutches, and they actually drove the 2-speed power shift with that also, because they had a remote pump to actually run the hydraulics on that. Now, Mike Verhulst came to me well, the story is what happened with these prototype parts is before they actually went to production, all engineering or all production for Hopkins had ceased, and they canceled the A4T 1900 program, and basically the components were sold off. The A4T 1900 transmissions and drop boxes. The drop boxes also had the helical gears in it, but the production was stopped, and the parts were scrapped. And what happened is these were bought by O'Brien Implement in northern Iowa, and they were in a salvage yard. So one of the Minneapolis Moline collectors, known by a lot of the collectors, his name was Philip Fett. Philip stumbled across these transmissions and drop boxes. They're bolted together in a configuration from the test stand. And he knew Mike was the engineer on the project. And he said, "Mike, what is this? What am I looking at?" Mike said, "Oh my goodness." He said, "I knew there was one of those floating around behind Schwarzrock's implement, but I never knew where these went." And Philip bought those 2 transmissions and drop boxes and brought them down to Mike. And Mike decided, you know what, I'm going to finish that 1900. I'm going to see that 1900 through to completion. So he tore those 2 transmissions and drop boxes apart over the next winter. And he spent all winter. They've been damaged some from out in the rust, but he took the best parts off of 2 transmissions, polished each gear individually, put it together, and he made one of them the test cutaway, or the cutaway that's downstairs for a demonstration and painted all the gears so you see it was. The other one he designed, he made it and rebuilt it into a working transmission. His intent was to put it into an A4T. The clutches, the hydraulic clutches that ran to 2-speed torque, when he took it apart, there were some cast iron piston rings seals that were damaged. And he kind of got hung up where he found that he couldn't source those seals. There was not anything, they looked in all of John Veer parts books, he looked through, he could not find a source of these cast iron piston ring seals that went on the hydraulic clutch drums. So I was actually working on a 2-star crawler at the time. And a 2-star crawler, the torque converter used a very similar piston ring seal. And I found a company in Ohio, somebody or other's cast iron piston ring, and I gave them the specification. They made me piston rings, seals for that torque converter, and I got the 2-star running. Well, I was telling Mike that story one day, and Mike says, "Where did you get those from?" And I gave him the number and so forth, and I saw him at the winter show the next year. He says, "Dave," he says, "I got a proposition for you." He says, "I'm getting up in years, and I want to see this 1900 done, and you know where to get the cast iron piston ring seals. Why don't you come and get this stuff and finish this project?" Of course, I was talking to Mike Verhulst. I was very honored. I was in the truck the next weekend and went down there, and he gave me all the stuff he had, the ledger. I got the transmission, the drop boxes and everything. He says, "Now, Dave," he says, "this is your tractor." He said, when we didn't have a tractor for Mule, he says, "I got all the components and all the knowledge." And we talked for about 3 hours. He says, "I want to be a part of this project. I want to have my name associated. When it's all done, it's going to stay in your barn." I'm like, "I'm good with that." So it was about 5 years' time. And Mike and I would have an engineering call about once a week, sometimes every couple of weeks. And I started putting this thing together, and I got the cast iron piston seals sourced and put it all together. I found a A4T. Now, you said, Dean, you asked, did some of those have 800s in them? The answer is yes. There's about maybe 30 that left the factory with 800s as test. And there's some implement dealers, Jennings Implement in Illinois is one of the dealers that actually field installed an 800. And they actually had a program where if you wanted to put an 800 in the tractor, you could return the 504 for credit. So some of that happened. But that's when they got into realizing that under heavy load in second gear, that they would start ruining gearboxes and the transmissions weren't surviving. That was the reason that they decided they needed to go to the 1900.
Go to a solid shaft and input shaft too, so you couldn't have a PTO in there. I remember because the hollow shaft, the live shaft, you go through it and flex.
On which one?
On if you put the 800 in, if you have an 800.
Okay, so that was probably the case.
800, you couldn't have a PTO.
Yeah, that was probably the case in the production units for the original 1600. Yeah. Now, with the 1900, the input shaft got much bigger in diameter, and it had a hollow shaft. The hollow shaft drove two things. The PTO on the back eventually, they never built one that actually had a PTO, but it also drove the generator pump on the back that ran the power shift. So that shaft, there was a hub on the back of the flywheel that drove the shaft that ran the generator pump at the back of the transmission. Actually, it was between the drop box and the transmission.
Is that the lube pump too for the transmission?
Yes. Yeah, I think it doubles. Yes, it did have ports going to lube. So this thing was run on test stands in Hopkins, but it was never actually put in a tractor. So that's what Mike and we actually did do engineering on this thing, because we had to come up with a flywheel and clutches somebody would work with this. So the coupler that they'd use to drive the test unit when they coupled it together, I cut that down and made it to where it would bolt in the back of the Moline flywheel. So we had that solved. The bigger issue was the throwout bearing and clutch. So I found, and I'm remembering this as I'm talking here, but I used the clutch plate, the outer cover, the clutch pressure plate from a production Moline with the 800 in it, but the drive for the clutch disc was different. I actually found that a case with a power shift had the same clutch disc, so I used the clutch disc from Moline and used the hub from the case and got the clutch disc to work. And then I had to design just from a billet of steel a throwout bearing fork and everything that would work, and that was a bit of a project, but got it all together, it would work. And, it was calls with Mike, what would you do here? And, well, measure the distance from the flange of the bell housing back to the face of where the throat should bearing and work backwards. And we just had these discussions. Another discussion I remember having with him is I got the thing all together, and going down the road in fifth gear, it would pop out of fifth gear, just kind of when you're shucking back and forth with no load. And I called him and said, Mike, this thing's popping out of gear. He says, we always tested those things under load. We never had a test environment where it was giving that back and forth negative and positive pressure on the gear train, especially in high gear. So his solution was, and we did, and I remember being able to get the shaft out of it while taking the whole tractor apart. But I took the shifter shaft out, and a couple things. Put a stiffer spring in it, so it had more pressure on the detent balls, but it still did it. It was a little bit better. It still did it. So the final solution was, and I got help from Lon Grossgeist to do this, is we took the shaft out and actually deepened the detent, the notch on the shaft, and you got to hit it pretty good to get it out of gear. You got to kind of bump it with your fist, but it doesn't jump out. It was a little trick that Lon learned when pulling tractors, because they would jump on. That's what he did. So I think I actually sent that to him, and he machined it a little deeper for me, and that was the solution for that. Another thing they hadn't gotten to how we're going to shift this thing. The high-low, they never had the point, even that 1900 in production didn't have the power shift on it. Or not in production, not the prototype. It didn't have a shifter on it because it didn't have a power shift on it. So what we did is we used some of the linkage that the A4T, or I'm sorry, the 1050 3-speed used. And we used that and that cable to activate the power shift on this also, because it was very close. And then this tractor didn't have a PTO, so we used the PTO lever to actuate the cable. So we kind of changed things around to make it all fit, but it worked out really well. This is a picture of the A4T. Now, part of the agreement, he says, I want to be part of this unit, and you're going to own it. He says, I just want to plow with it at a show. So it was about 5 years in. And I said, Mike, we got to get this thing to a show where you want it to go. And he said, well, so-and-so's not feeling well, and I don't feel like I can get away. Like, Mike, you got to pick something. So he picked a show, and he arranged for someone to watch over his loved one while he was away. And it was Rantoul, Illinois, 2017. And Lauren Book had a lot to do with this. He took all the video and captured that and documented a lot of these pictures. But Mike went down to that show. I had it trucked down there, and he had to take the safety training to be able to plow at the show. And he said, well, Dave, you got to take the training. I'm like, Mike, I've never plowed with an A4T. I wouldn't know where to start. You're going to have to do this. So he spent 3 days down there. Every time they went out to the field, you could see all the carts and so forth in the field. If you've ever been to Rantoul, Illinois, I think it's probably the biggest working show in the United States, and if not the world. But it was basically the first live test of the power shift and the tractor in general. I did some things, move things around, make sure it wasn't going to overheat, but I never really put it under load till it got down there. And we didn't know how it was going to work, but obviously he plowed with it all weekend and held together. So, of course, I was sweating, but it was good. The one thing he did say, he says, if we were to do this in development and really put in production, he says there's a little bit of lag between high and low, and you get a little bit of a jerk out of it. And he says, we really never found a way to simulate that without actual field testing. He says, so probably what we would have done is we would have moved the ports, the lands on the spool valve a little closer together. He said, but the way it is, it's going to be fine. So that was a success. And he spent all weekend. Anybody who wanted to see could walk up and see that test cutaway. He would explain to them what was going on. And just people were standing in line to talk to Mike to understand just how that went. It was on Max's Tractor Shed. It was on Antique Power, both Moline magazines had articles about it. It was just a really great experience. So that was the 1900, and we got some more slides, but something Lauren Book and I were honored that after, unfortunately, the rest of the story is Mike plowed with us at Rantoul in September or August. Rantoul, August of 2017, and he passed away in the spring of 2018. But again, he got a chance to plow with it. But about a year later, his family called Lauren Book and I and said, hey, Mike's got a lot of stuff down in his office, and we don't really know what it is. Could you guys come down here and sort it out? So I spent an afternoon in Mike's office sorting through things, and I found things that were very interesting. And I'm going to tell you, there's probably not been two people that ever saw this before today, so you can see it right here live. I'll put it. But the next plan was an A4T 2000. In the A4T 2000, I just put the fold-out drawing on the table. It was designed to have, and I told you this wrong yesterday, it was designed to have a 1210 V12 engine in it. So Minneapolis Molding was doing very early development of a V1210 and a V1600. The 1210 was a V version of the 605, and the V1600 was a V cylinder or a V configuration of the 800. I'm understanding that a couple of the V1600s were built, but they didn't hold together real well, and that program got scrapped. But this was the plan, and this thing would have been, and if you look at the differentials, the drawing says 135 horse. So that would have been like 270 horse. I'm thinking those were probably planetary drive axles at that point. They were probably using the G1350 drives in the planetaries along with that. And you can see they had plans, that's the actual drawing. They had packaging plans for that. So that was I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this before. I certainly hadn't until I found the drawing on Mike's desk. Here's Mike talking at the museum here. He spent a lot of time here at the museum doing research. He was an advocate for everything that was happening in Charles City and the great support and teamwork we had for the team with the team here. He always liked to educate people and tell his experiences. And he spent a lot of time, like I said, doing research. He was on the MMCI board of directors. And he had a lot to do with relationship here with the museum. Now you'll see the guy on the right here. I believe that this was probably the last time Mike presented was here at the museum. It was winter of 2018, I think like February. There's a big snowstorm the next day. But he was here and they were talking about, it was an open forum. I wasn't able to attend it. They're making me take care of the auction. But Dean was here and they all three sat there and presented and talked about, here's Mike doing some research down in the basement here at the museum, looking at things. He called and said, Dave, because I worked on the paint committee, he says, I found some diagrams down there that show where the decals go. You got to see this. So he's always looking and trying to spread experiences and knowledge. So anyway, Mike Verhulst there. So we go on the next page. Yeah, okay. So if you were in Minneapolis Moline or in Oliver in the 70 to 73 time frame, it was probably a pretty confusing time in the company, if you worked there or if you were a dealer, because there's a lot of things going on that White was doing to convert to newer tractors, to different designs. But they were kind of combining the two companies, merging Oliver and Minneapolis Molding. We're going to show you a few things that were going on. So this is just a production schedule for what they're trying to do at Lake Street to wrap up the production of some of these tractors. And it's kind of an eye chart. If somebody wants to see it, I can show it to them. But just to give you examples of some of the things that were going on. So the G950 was something that was built up in Hopkins. And it was a pretty popular tractor, but the sales were falling off quite a bit. And what they did is they rebadged that thing as an 1865 Oliver. Now a G950 had a 451 cubic inch diesel engine. It was a pretty solid engine, and they painted the things yellow and made them Olivers. Now there weren't very many sold because the Oliver guys, they didn't want them any mold painted green, right? It just didn't work very well. I've got production numbers I'll show you later, but they weren't sold real well. But what it did do is it gave the dealership a chance to have another set of literature. They had to update all the service manuals. They had to update all the parts manuals, have all this stuff and sell just a few dozen tractors, right? They did it also with the 2055. The 2055 was a rebadged Minneapolis Moline G950. The 1350 was a rebadged, or the 2155 was a rebadged Minneapolis Moline G1350. So again, the Oliver guys didn't want a green Moline very badly, but they could have bought them, and a few did.
I showed them the brochures too.
I'm sorry?
You go back to those brochures, the Moline ones are all hype and glory and, color in the brochure, and then you get black and white newsprint for the Oliver.
There weren't a lot of those brochures out there. These are copies that Brian Gagne supplied with me. He'd found them, he's collected them, but they're hard to find compared to Moline one for sure. Okay, so the other thing that was going on is they said, well, if the Oliver guys are going to get Molines, the Moline guys are going to get Olivers. So in the 1971 model year, the 1555 Oliver was rebadged as a Moline G550, of course, and then the 1655 Oliver was rebadged as G750. The 1755 Oliver is a G850, and then the 1855 was rebadged as G940. So that gave the molding guys an opportunity. Now you're saying, okay, how well did these things go over? So they sold 24 G550s. They sold a few G750s, G740s. They sold 22 two-wheel drives and 3 four-wheel drives. Now here's the funny thing: molding collectors are looking for these things because they're painted yellow, right? So they thought. So if you see, and probably, I'd hate to guess, maybe 20-25% of these things that we found are actually painted Oliver green now. Yeah. So what would happen is you know what's going on. The guy's looking for an Oliver, and Oliver, our dealer, says, I can't find you a G5, or I can't find you a 1555, but there's a yellow one that I could sell you. I can get it from a local molding dealer. Well, I don't want no yellow tractor on my property. Well, we painted Oliver green, so they painted the thing Oliver green, but it still had the molding grill in it. So if you see an Oliver, one of these models with a molding grill in it, go look at the serial number because it's probably a molding collector looking for it. So that's one of the things that happened. And then at the same time, the small tractors were coming from Italy. These little Fiats, these are good little tractors, but they were being imported. So there's a lot of 1265 Olivers built. Those were real popular, especially in Canada and on the East Coast. You saw a lot of those things. But they were rebadged as a G350 Minneapolis molding, and that was a 3-cylinder version. And then in Canada, they called them a 1270 white. And then about 74, 75, they called them a 2-50 white Field Boss. So they actually, they stayed around for several years until they actually got the white styling on. And then one size bigger, the 4-cylinder version, you saw quite a few 1365 Olivers. I grew up in northern Michigan, Wisconsin. A lot of dairy farms used those. A lot of those had loaders on them. That was a pretty high volume unit. I don't have production numbers on them. They came in through 3 different ports, so I think it'd be pretty hard to track. Some of them, I think, came into Charles City. Some of them went into Canada, and some of them went into Atlanta. I think some of them went in Ontario, and some of them went in Atlanta. So there's 3 different places that records are. There's some of them here, but that's just part of the story. And then those became a 2-60 white. I actually grew up farming at a farm that had a 260 white. I spent a lot of time on it. Good little tractor. But it was
David, what did he say at the last meeting? We had Co-op Federated in Eastern Canada there. They had almost 50% of the market share of those Fiat tractors.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, they're so reliable that in about 2004, 2005, there was a guy up in Canada called Import Tractor Parts. He was selling parts for those. He told me they're still producing that unit with the same sheet metal in Romania. And you could buy them for the Canadian market. They wouldn't meet emissions for U.S. markets, but you could still buy those things. Is there? Okay. And then they were also marketed by New Holland and Long, Alice Chalmers 540s that just had a different grill and painted orange. They were just crazy. Those things were all over. Everybody's buying them, and they changed a little bit. The fenders were a little bit different on the Moldings than on the Longs and the Fords, but very, very similar. Anyway, you'll see a lot of these things around. So then you get to the final stage of Minneapolis molding. They moved down to everything closed up. My understanding is engineering was still up in Hopkins, but production was all down here in Charles City. And, obviously it didn't work to convince the Oliver guys to buy the moldings or molding guys to buy Oliver. So we're going to give you half of each. So that's where the G955 was born. The G955, correct me, Dean, I think it was a 1955 Oliver rear end, married to a 451 Minneapolis molding diesel engine, or a 425 propane engine if it was a propane version. But if you look at this thing literally, you'll see at the line here, from here back, it was 99% Oliver. The steering column, dash, everything. From here forward, it was 99% Minneapolis molding. It used the Minneapolis molding fuel tank, the frame rails, the grill, I think, was shared with Minneapolis molding, the front axle. Marrying me, the steering cylinders might have been a hybrid, probably some of the plumbing and wiring, but these things were pretty much cut in the middle. I've seen pictures of the back half being green, the front half yellow. Guys painted them up that way. And of course, they're marketed as a G1355 Oliver, a G955 Oliver, G955 molding. Or in Canada, of course, they'd be different. To follow the cockshot heritage, they call them an 1870 white. So there's some of those. How many did they build? I actually found that information this morning. between the 1973 and 1974 calendar years, there were 930 of these built. I can't tell you which ones are green, yellow, or red, but there's 930 total productions. And of course, we had to do that with the bigger ones too. So the 1355 was an Oliver 2255 that got the 585 diesel or 504 BLP if it was the LP version. We painted them green for the Oliver guys. And then it had the white guys got a 2270. The red ones up in Canada. And then even afterwards, it outlived 1974, it became the 2150 white. Beautiful tractor, not real reliable with the engines at that point. I can just tell Dean's got a comment about it. Dean lived through some nightmares, so he was in the plant by this time. Right. Now, I'll tell you, I own a 955 and a 1355. I think they really pecked the best of both worlds. I mean, you get the higher horsepower 310 Waukesha. They had some reliability problems themselves. But I'll tell you, the refinements in the Oliver steering and transmission and brakes, I really appreciated those. And I'll tell you, these things are still working on farms today. I personally experienced this morning a 1355 on a feed mixer wagon feeding cows in Charles City, Iowa. And if you want to see that exact tractor, you can step outside later and see it for yourself. We can show you that to you.
Larry can say something to this. He was involved in the USAC showdown, and the guys that were there said, of course the 2255 was going to win it, but they said, don't bring a G1355 down here. It wouldn't start like a cat.
Well, enough either it would.
But yeah.
A couple of things I noticed that on those engines, Oliver put their touch on it. They got much quieter mufflers when they went into Olivers, or when they got married up to Olivers. The quietest two tractors I have are the 955 and 1355. They don't have that nice straight loud muffler that Moline has. And the other thing is they have electric shutoff solenoids on the injection pumps. Moline, you got to pull the lever back, shut them off. Oliver, you can turn the key off. So that's something I noticed. Okay, so production numbers, and I got to thank Brian Gagne for this. Okay, so you're looking at the A4T production numbers on top. The 2655s, they made 561 of them. And it's A4T 1600s, both with the 585s, they made 629. So they made a few more Molines in that category. When you look at the LPs, there was a total of 239 built and only 26, let's see. With the total, okay, it depends on if you look at 800s or with 504s, but with 800s, there's actually a lot more Olivers that were made than the A4Ts. There was 45 Olivers that those were put in, 2655s and only 26 A4Ts, and it was a little different when you look at the little 506 4Bs, a lot more of those went in the Molines. And then there was only one 2455 maybe built. It may have been repainted as a Moline. It's not real sure. And that could be a discussion for weeks still. But so 1350 Molines, you could tell there was only 80 of the 2155s built. So they convinced 242 Moline guys to buy them, but only 80 Olivers. The LPs, it was they didn't convince a single Oliver guy to buy one of those. The 1050s, the Olivers, they only sold 26 of those, so that was a hard sell too. We talked about it earlier. They didn't convince any Oliver guys to buy an LP, or maybe they didn't even offer them, but there weren't any. 57 of the 1865, so pretty few. Imagine me and an Oliver deal have the parts and everything in the books and everything and all this stuff. That a few sold, and then 950 LP, none of those were sold. 57 of the diesels. Now the 2655s, we got some more production numbers there. The 2655s were made from 1970 to 72. 2155s, the 2055s, 1865s, that was 71, 72 production time. The black and white demonstrator 950 and 1050. So if you see some of these 950s, they were red and they had a black stripe, and they were demonstrator models given to some of the dealers. A lot of them were up in Canada, in fact. But that was a 1969 model year. In 1970, you'll see some of the 1050s and 950 and 1350 Molines that are red, white, and blue. and I think probably there was less than 30 or 40 of those total made. 8 of this model, 9 of that model, and so forth. It's hard to tell because if you go look to ledgers here in Charles City, some of them they wrote in demonstrator or red, white, and blue in the margin on the ledger. Some of them, even though we know they were, it doesn't say it on the ledger, so it wasn't real consistent records, but there were some of them made. And then the A4Ts were called plainsmen at that time. So the A4T plainsmen were made in 1970, and again, they were just a heritage model just for the dealers to advertise. And then they're, let's see, okay, the Canadian market, red, white, and black. Oh yeah, so when you start getting the late Molings, a lot of them from 1970 on, a lot of them had white on the grills. They had Minneapolis Moline on the side badges, but the grill emblem would say white on them. And that's most of what I have here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. All right, so we're out here with Dean Jaden, the owner of this beautiful G1355. This is a 1974 model. It's got some custom tips that Dean's done to improve it over the years. We might point some of those out as his after factory improvements. But if you look here, as we were talking about earlier, the Oliver basically tractor stops right here. Everything from this point back, the dash, the 3-speed, the clutch, the 3-speed, that's all part of Oliver production. Minneapolis Moline, this frame rail, I believe, would interface or would fit right on a G1350 Moline. Whereas an Oliver, at this point, they had a big cast iron tub from here forward. That was known to be an Oliver. These frame rails are very unique to Minneapolis Moline. The engine from this point forward, that's all Minneapolis Moline. I know it's got electric fuel shut off. I think that was an improvement that probably Oliver insisted on. And I like it a lot better. You turn off the key, the tractor shuts off. But that's something that Minneapolis Moline didn't do. While it was just a unique Minneapolis Moline tractor, as in this case a G1350. The front axle is very definitely, as I look at it, it's just the same thing as a Minneapolis Moline G1050, G1350 with an 8-bolt wheel on it. The steering cylinders are very similar. I think some of the Minneapolis Molines had 1 and this has 2, probably because it's a larger unit. But if you look at the front pedestal underneath here, the steering wedge and so forth is very definitely Minneapolis Moline. The cast iron grill is, the grill insert's a little bit unique, but the rest of the cast iron is definitely Minneapolis Moline. And the hood to this point basically is Minneapolis Moline, and then this is the transition to the Oliver part. There's some hydraulic lines that obviously had to be developed, a few interface things, but these production components are mostly were with the individual manufacturers before they married these two together. It would have been, I think, a pretty quick production time from design to production, because it's just probably a 98% reuse of materials. Dean, you have some other comments?
Other than this the transition casting here, that was all designed by the individual. He was a Minneapolis Moline engineer, and that was Lee Vaughn was the one that did that transition casting.
So that is unique to this tractor.
That is very unique. Well, it's unique to this and the G955.
Yep.
Basically, it's the same casting, and it's a little. It utilizes where it supports the over/under and everything. They use a trunnion mount between the over/under and the transmission, but that there's no weight load on that. That's all just aligned. It's all supported by that transition casting. There is. I was at a show last summer where it's in Minnesota, and I can't think of his name right now, that has he's quite sure, and I looked at it, looks like a prototype G1355, because there's you know some things that are very unique to it that are not in the production tractors. So.
Steve Corpse.
Yeah,
Corpse.
Steve Corpse. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that Corf. Yeah, Corf implement is what he. But I was up and looked at that, and there was some very unique things on that 1355.
Now, Dean, I have it from a good source that you used to have a white tractor on your feeder mixer wagon, and that went down, and now you put this Moline tractor on your feeder mixer wagon, and you don't want to go back. Could you explain that decision?
Well, it's nice not having a cab, and the white was a 2135, and it had, like a lot of 2135s, steering cylinder blew out on it, and while it was down, we put this on for the summer, and this has been on. This is supposed to be just a parade show tractor, but
obviously it's had to go back to its work.
Just to go back to work.
And this was bought brand new by my dad, and my brother Larry's in the crowd here. This was my mother's favorite tractor. Of course, she went from a 930 case to this, so you can imagine how much she thought of an improvement a tractor was.
Yeah. And you bought this new, right? Or
Brand new.
Yeah.
Yeah, traded in a 1900 Oliver on it.
Now, my own curiosity, I'm not trying to be smarter. Why did you select the 1355 over the size Oliver at that time?
Can Larry, you have an answer to that? Schwarzrock Implement was the dealer, and he convinced my dad that this would be a good tractor, and I guess.
Our Schwarzrock was an old MM dealer.
Yeah.
No, I knew Harold.
Yeah.
And
And the story was the yellow the Minneapolis Moline 1355s had more power than the Oliver G1355. Same tractor. It didn't, but that was an MM dealer convincing you that.
you want to mention your upgrades?
Well, we did, as you've mentioned before in your presentation, the 585 motor, one of the things that it lacks is its ability to breathe. And so I put on a turbocharger, basically manufactured it all myself, the manifold and everything on it. Thus is why the bubble on the hood, to get everything underneath the hood. But to get a little boost pressure to it, not a tremendous amount, but it does bring the tractor really low.
Would you say it's over 300 horsepower?
Oh no! If it was, nothing else would hold together on it. But it's I did it more for the sound than anything. I just love the whistle of it.
Yeah.
So, but they're good. That 585 motor, of course, now it wouldn't even come close to meeting any emission standards. But aside from a not a real cold starting motor, they're pretty good motor, really.
Yeah, I mean they had some upgrades. The earlier ones before this, they had crankshaft problems, and a lot of that was because they went to this external loop.
And this one has the external
It's got the
lubrication.
external loop pump, and that
Yep.
solved that problem, I think, a lot. Like so many others, you ran them hot and got too much ether, and there's stories about breaking pistons, but I think you could do that with anything.
In fact, this tractor, this pump setup, I was working in the service department at the time, and to establish the flat rate on how much we'd compensate dealers for putting on the external loop pump, this was the one that was we did the actual changeover on this tractor, the very first external loop pump setup. So
It's actually out at the farm under a tree.
yeah, it was done laying out at the farm, under a shade tree.
Excellent. Any other comments? Anybody? Any questions?
Good old tractor. It was destined for the salvage yard, but my mother more or less said it broke a crank. Well, what happened is the main bearing cap bolts broke on it. We kept running it, it was making a little tick, 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 rattle, knock, knock, but I'll just turn the radio up. We're still using it, elevating car and everything. Well, then it got to be very severe, and it was broke a crankshaft, and it was going to go to the salvage yard, and my mother at the time said, that's the last new tractor your father ever had bought. I think you better fix it. So then it went to Plan B. I'm glad we kept it.
And I know where the old original engine went, and it's getting good use too. It's reviving a 2150 white, so good. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.